Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Krause. This is the legislative update brought to you each month by the Williamson, Inc., our local Chamber of Commerce. Glad to have some bright-eyed folks here at Columbia State this morning, and look forward to having a conversation with you all here before it's over with. And we're glad to have our audience on Cable Channel 3, WCTV, and WAKM Radio. So we are, I think, going to have a really interesting program this morning. It rose out of an open house I went to a couple of months ago, and we've asked the South Corridor Study Team to come and let us ask a few questions about the South Corridor Study. Most of us, I think, have heard about the South Corridor Study, but I would venture to say that a lot of people still don't know what that is, and we want to clear that up and help everybody understand what it is, where it came from, and what the objectives are. Our guests this morning are Michelle Lacewell, here to my left. She is the Deputy Director at the Greater National Regional Council, which she's going to explain to us here in a few minutes. Sean Falzer is a transportation planner with the GNRC, and he is the one that piqued my interest in this subject, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Tim Reynolds is from Cincinnati. He is the lead, the boss of the study, works for WSP Incorporated out of Cincinnati, and we are appreciative of you coming into Nashville today, or to Franklin, and being with us, Tim. Michelle, we're going to start with you, and you're a Florida State grad. You've got to Nashville somehow a few years ago.
I did.
Tell us what brought you to Nashville, what you actually do at GNRC, and then tell us what the Greater National Regional Council is.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much for having us. I am Michelle Lacewell. I'm our Deputy Director, and I moved to Nashville in 2011. I got married and followed a boy to Nashville, and we thought we'd be here for 2 years, and while he went to Owen to do his MBA, and now here we are 9 years later. And I think a lot of people have that same story where they come to Nashville or they come to anywhere in Middle Tennessee and they end up really enjoying themselves here. So, and like you said, I am with the Greater Nashville Regional Council. My responsibilities are the oversight of operations within inside the organization, strategic planning, communications, and supporting all the outreach activities of our organization. And the Greater Nashville Regional Council, or GNRC, as you may have heard of us before, I hope, is the development district for this part of the state. So there are 9 development districts that are designated by state statute in the state of Tennessee. And we serve as a council of governments supporting 13 counties in Middle Tennessee. And as part of our responsibilities, we are the designated economic development district for this Middle Tennessee. We are the federally designated transportation planning agency for Middle Tennessee, and we're also the area agency on aging and disability for Middle Tennessee. So what that means is that we have the ability to bring together folks that are doing planning and execution work for state and federal grants across a variety of programs and services. So we really help coordinate better use of our limited state and federal dollars for various grant programs. I mentioned the regional transportation planning work that we do. In that role, we are responsible for ensuring that the planning activities that keep us eligible for state and federal dollars are carried out, but also that federal dollars that come down from Washington to us to spend on roadways, infrastructure, greenways, sidewalks, transit, things like that, are spent in the best way possible. We are led by a board that our regional council has 93 members. Those members are the elected officials in the jurisdictions across the region. We have roughly 32 members on our executive board that are all mayors of the various communities or appointed members. We have some minority and industry appointed members. And those are the folks that help us make decisions and lead the process for setting priorities for the region. In the transportation planning space, the mayors are the ones that get to make the final decision to adopt our long-range planning. And so this is an opportunity to bring everyone together in the sandbox and say, we only have this much money to spend over the next 20 years. How are we going to do that as best possible and as equitable as possible to make the greatest impact on the region? And so it's your mayors across the region that really drive the work we do and make the decisions on how we spend our funding.
So to summarize the way I understand it, then you all tell us how we're going to spend the federal highway money that comes into Middle Tennessee and other grants that do other.
You all tell us, and then we do the paperwork.
Okay.
So, and that's, the plans and projects that come to us come from the local level and are filtered up through our planning process.
How much money a year are we talking about?
Per year, Sean could probably answer. I would tell you our current plan has $8.5 billion in it over the next, from 2016 looking out to 2040. How much is in our current transportation plan?
We have a draft TIP, which is a short-range program of transportation investments, and that's roughly $1 billion over the next 4 years.
Okay, so $250 million a year. That doesn't go very far when you're spending it like it costs to build roads and the other things that you all advise on. Sean, you're from Boston.
I actually grew up in California. California and made my way across the Midwest for college and then to Boston to start my career. Worked in Boston for about 7 years doing transportation planning for the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization that Michelle just touched upon. So got an opportunity to work there before moving to Nashville about 3 years ago. My wife got an opportunity to do research at Vanderbilt, and she's still there. We made the move down here and haven't regretted it since, but kind of jumped back in recently at GNRC to manage the transportation planning program and a lot of this transportation planning and programming that we do with our Transportation Policy Board. And we have a lot of work underway. In addition to the South Corridor study, we're developing our latest short-range plan of projects that you'll see under construction over the next 4 years, but then we're also developing our long-range transportation plan that looks out 25 years to identify how we're going to address growth and development over that time horizon.
Did you learn anything in Boston that you can apply to the Nashville metro area? Bury it all.
There's a lot of lessons to be learned. I think, obviously the Boston region is very urbanized, dense area that has had transit for over 100 years. Mm-hmm. There was transit in the Middle Tennessee area at one point as well, and so I think we're exploring that as part of this study. I think we can get into some of the case studies, but I think one interesting aspect that Michelle and I were talking about the other day was just one aspect of Boston that allows it to thrive as it does is its daytime population, or its population changes from about 670,000 people to 1.2 million during the daytime, given all of the people that have to come in for work.
Right.
And so transit is part of that component that allows that to happen.
Yeah, gotcha. Let's get to know Tim just a little bit better here, and then we'll come back to the background of the Nashville efforts. But Tim, you've been in transportation planning, it looks like, if my math is right, about 40 years. I thought your hair was going to be about like mine, thin and not dark.
For every year that I'm have another year under my belt is another year I take away on my resume. I think it's the smart thing to do. But yeah, I've been in the transportation planning and transit planning business for quite some time. I'm with WSP. I've been with that firm for about 10 years now and do a lot of consulting across the country, and most recently managed what's called Metro Next in Houston, which is their long-range plan, which is going to the voters for a bond issue this fall. So there are a lot of some parallels to that project as relating to the South Corridor. It's remarkable when you're in Houston to look at the traffic. It's known for its traffic. You come to Nashville and a much smaller metropolitan area, and it's got Houston-like traffic. So, the issues throughout the Nashville region, especially in the South Corridor, they're intense. And so we're very happy to have the opportunity to work for GNRC and the South Corridor communities on this project.
Great, great. Before we get into the presentation, I want to tell a story. I think you would kindly call me a transit skeptic. I've been reluctantly kind of watching from the sidelines what's going on with transit and not really understanding how that could fit into the Williamson County picture. But I decided to go to one of the South Corridor study open houses recently and was challenging Sean to convince me that transit was indeed part of the answer to the problems that we all are familiar with of getting around during primarily rush hour. And I was saying, why don't we just add a couple more lanes to I-65, put some up over the top of it if we need to, or whatever it takes, and let the users of the transportation pay their own operating expenses instead of saddling the taxpayers with a big light rail or something that has ongoing expense. And he said, well, that works pretty good until you get to downtown Nashville. And he said, then you get all those cars in the core city, and it just all comes to a stop, as I recall you explaining this to me. And it brought to mind, I had lunch with a friend of mine a couple of months ago downtown Nashville who works at Pinnacle Bank. And we were talking about things, and he expressed that sometimes it takes him 30 minutes to get from Pinnacle Bank to the interstate, from downtown to the interstate. And I went, well, yeah, that's a problem, and you can't fix that. I mean, I don't think Demumbrium Street can have any more lanes than it's got. So transit's got to be a part of the solution to that problem, I think, fairly. And so I got to exploring more about this and wanted to get you all to help us understand what the realistic options are specific to Williamson County and how they fit in with maybe what the plans are in Nashville. Now, Michelle, you and Sean both have been involved in the referendum last year that Nashville proposed. Wanted to spend about $5.3 billion. 4.3 of it was on light rail, looks like. Another billion was on more buses and infrastructure to make buses more attractive, transit centers and things like that. But none of that seemed to come our way toward Williamson County. Is that a fair statement?
The referendum that was proposed was county specific, correct?
So what do you think? Obviously, there was a political problem with the mayor right in the midst of all that.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And it's hard to measure the merits of the referendum when you have the political chaos going on in the background. But tell us a little bit about what was proposed, what was received well. Did you get Lee Beeman to come on anything? Not a fair question. What was received well? What do you think has a chance of moving forward at some point?
Okay, that's a great question. So, and to address what you just said, in all honesty, one big lesson learned was that I think that the referendum and the service and the investment of transit that was proposed was related too closely to a person and not a purpose. And I think that that was a really big lesson learned for us, is that it's not about who's in office and it's not about who's in charge today, but what is the purpose that we're trying to achieve for the greater good, or for tomorrow, or for 20 years. And so that was a real lesson learned for us. Your other question about what has been, well, let me back up a little bit. So in 2010, there was a transit vision that was set by the mayors across the region. And then in 2016, there was an adoption of a in-motion plan, which is a strategic planning process for the next 25 years that the Regional Transit Authority is supposed to be implementing, or using as their guide to implement and grow. And that did have very limited attention to the South Corridor. So when that plan was developed, it was a regional plan, or regional strategic plan, but it had limited recommendations on the South Corridor. And that's not to knock the development of that plan, but the studies, as our agency is responsible for conducting these studies, hadn't been completed yet on this South Corridor. And so then they didn't have additional work to do on that front. So the Let's Move Nashville program of projects, which was lifted from In Motion to create what went on the ballot, it was county specific, because that is also the way the legislation's written, is that it's a county by county vote. Now, we can talk about, could we go multiple counties at a time, and the answer is yes. But at the time, it was a county-specific vote. And so some of the criticism was, well, this isn't regional enough. Well, it wasn't regional enough. It was a Davidson County voters being asked if they want to fund things in Davidson County. And so that is also something that we've learned, is that, there's always going to be this, well, it's not going to do enough, or it's costs too much and I don't want to deal with it. That's kind of the balance that we work between. So understanding that there was not enough communication on what you said about the 1 billion in some, that was on the ground bus improvements, on the ground infrastructure improvements, and things that were going to happen in the next 1 to 5 years. I can't tell you how many friends that know that we're in this space for a living, and after the referendum were like, well, I would have voted for it if I knew. And I was like, It did, and so, right. but going down that path, the problem, I think, also is that this costs a lot of money, and life costs a lot of money, and it's hard to have people compartmentalize the way their tax dollars are spent in different spaces based on what they perceive as important, and so we did. I mean, I'll tell you, as folks that did town halls like this all the time, got caught up in chasing the opposition's arguments that everything was too expensive. And so I would sit in meetings like this and debate the merit of the cost per mile, and that wasn't what we should be doing. We should have been talking about why this was the right decision, or why this was a decision to make today, so as we evolve, we can keep up with our growing population and those sorts of things. So that's also a lesson learned, that we let the big, shiny, the scary, it costs money, really get in the way of us telling our message and helping educate people, instead of just reinforcing the opinion that it costs money. Well, yes, it does. And then they'd leave the room going, yep, I heard it costs money. And so that was a real breakdown, is that there wasn't a lot of education opportunity to really help people understand what the technology improvements were, what the roadway improvements are, what the sidewalk improvements were, and how it was going to make a difference in 12 months, and in 12 years, and in 24 years, and that's something that was significant.
Sean, the plan consisted of, I think, 6 light rail lines out Hillsborough Road, I believe, West End, and around the spokes of the transportation in Nashville. And again, that was, $1 billion was for 2 tunnels under downtown Nashville to get everybody to downtown Nashville. But did you like the plan? Do you think it was the right one? Or what would you have changed about it if you could change it now?
I think that there was a lot of components that were identifying solutions to the problems. The tunnel, for instance, that you mentioned, one of the things that they identified is the bus speeds within downtown were about 4 or 5 miles an hour. And so a logical long-term solution to address that problem and provide those reliable commutes if people were taking the bus in and out of downtown became a tunnel solution. I know that one was one of the controversial ones. And we talked about the Big Dig comparison, which probably is not the most fair comparison because Big Dig was mega project and involved taking the whole highway and putting it underground, right. And then adding also the Ted Williams tunnel under the Boston Harbor to the airport. But there wasn't a proposal to put the tunnel under the Cumberland as part of that. But I think it did identify solving that downtown problem of getting that dedicated right away in order to get the buses in and out of downtown. And as we've talked about, there is slow speeds downtown. Even getting out of your parking garage can be a challenge.
Right.
But I think also the other thing that we'd mention, the light rail corridors that you mentioned, I think were a starting point for a regional system as well. So starting in Davidson County and building that foundation, a lot of these rail lines that are implemented across the country are phased in and start in the core and move outwards. Oftentimes are not able to build the whole system at once. And so I think it was building that foundation that could be extended as other counties then went to referendum.
Right. The light rail reminds me of old streetcars. They're not trains going up and down the tracks as much. I mean, they are on tracks, but they're in the middle of the street, so it's something we haven't had around here. But that's good background on that. With that background in mind, let's go into your presentation, which I have hijacked the clicker this morning. But, so
we're at your mercy.
But we've talked about Greater National Regional Council. TDOT is involved in this, obviously. Who is WeGo Public Transit?
WeGo Public Transit is the new brand for the MTA, which is the Metropolitan Transit Authority, and RTA, the Regional Transit Authority, that operate the bus system and the Music City Star that are currently operating in Middle Tennessee right now.
Okay, and this study stretches from downtown Nashville to Columbia, is that correct?
It does, yes, it does.
And primarily around the I-65 corridor, also looking at Highway 31, Columbia Avenue in Franklin, and all of the everything in between. What are you looking for, Michelle, Sean?
So I'll say briefly what we're looking for. First off is to hear from as many people along the corridor what they think they want, what they know they want, and what they don't know they need, but they're asking us to tell them how we could find those solutions. And that's how we'll get to what's called a locally preferred alternative, and I'll let one of you guys explain that in detail.
Okay, so locally preferred alternative is essentially the consensus recommendation based upon the data, what stakeholders have to say, what the public has to say, and the project that combines in terms of its cost and its benefits in terms of ridership and environmental benefits and benefits to quality of life, that then gets adopted typically by GNRC and others into its transportation plans, particularly the long-range plan, which then makes it eligible, a little bit louder, makes it eligible for funding on different levels, whether it's local, state, or federal.
And when you say locally preferred alternative, what weight do you give to a guy like me off the street that really doesn't know that much about transit versus Mayor Moore?
Well, and Michelle was talking about, during the referendum from a little while back, that education wasn't, there wasn't a lot of time to do a lot of education. And it's not a simple issue in terms of talking about what are the problems in the corridor, what are the projections for the future, what's capacity of the highway system going to be like 10, 20 years down the line. Everyone experiences a lot of congestion right now, and that's, the daily thing everyone talks about. But, as we go into the future, can we rely upon this expressway, these roadways? Are we able to expand those? And are there alternatives to add additional capacity and more transportation choice for folks in the corridor? It's interesting when you start diving into the data and the statistics on the project, is that, yes, there's a huge flow of commuters heading toward Nashville, northbound in the morning, but there are more people who actually come to this corridor, Davidson and Murray and Williamson counties, than there are in the other direction overall, whether it's along the interstate or some of the roadways. So you've got a lot of interaction going in both directions that's creeping up, and I think we're already facing that. And in the long term, a lot of people are talking about the Nashville-Huntsville corridor. So it's growing very fast, and so the idea of what are some of the options to build and create more capacity and more choice for people?
Right. Michelle?
Yes.
Where are we?
So we're a little more than halfway through the process. You'll see on the screen that the first bar across the top is a lot of time and energy spent on what Tim referenced, the collection of existing conditions along the corridor. What are we experiencing now? Understanding the projections based on growth and development expectations, so that we have a really good base to build off of when we're trying to make determinations on the impact that some of these options will have on the future.
Okay. Sean, what are the, I skipped a slide somehow on my notes, but purpose and need. Tell us what you're looking for from us.
Sure. Just to kind of talk about that locally preferred alternative and relate it to the regional transportation plan. We're kicking off our call for projects at the end of October, and as part of that, we'll be soliciting local governments for roadway projects, bicycle and pedestrian projects. We'll be asking the transit agencies for transit projects as well, and so the results of this study and having that local preferred alternative could translate into a project under consideration by our board through this process. And we evaluate all of those projects against one another and then identify which ones to secure funding for over that 25-year horizon. So that would be one outcome, is incorporating recommendations from this study to be considered for funding.
Basically building consensus, sounds like. Tim? Technical screening goals.
Is
that your area?
It is, although a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders and the public will have an opportunity to look at, okay, how do the alternatives that we're looking at compare with one another, and what are the benefits, and what are their costs, for instance. So we develop, based upon what we're hearing from the public and from the data, what are the goals that we're going to be measuring these alternatives based upon. So, you've got some generalized ones. What about enhancing quality of life, land use patterns, and, maybe land use changes, providing more opportunities for mobility in the region. We've got a couple of slides on this, if you could advance. Is it cost effective? What is the cost benefit ratio for some of these options? Majority of people ride, single occupant vehicle. From a capacity point of view and the use of the roadway system, that's not all that efficient. Have all that space in just one person. So, how do we build the usage of the existing facility? For instance, creating a more integrated transportation system that's not 100% car-oriented, not taking away cars from anybody, but giving people options out there. And if we can move to the next slide. I think there's a little bit more on goals there. Let's see what we can do. Well, that was about it. But in other words, we have a lot of numbers, a lot of metrics that we're going to be looking at, as well as some qualitative factors. And all those will be scored and will help us mutually come to the recommendation of what the locally preferred alternative should be.
Michelle, you're going to take this clicker back away from me. Did we cover that okay?
You did great.
What have we heard so far?
So to date, we've had 8 open houses along the corridor. We've had a lot of media pickup where we've been either done interviews or had other coverage from around the region, and then we've done a lot of meetings like this. That says 45 plus. That probably needs to be updated. We're doing a lot of out and about, coming to where people are, because it's hard to go to a public meeting, and a lot of people, if they didn't have to go for their job, don't go to a public meeting. So we're making a real valiant effort. What we've heard is that people are tired of waiting, and they're tired of hearing about studies. Now, that's unfortunate because we're required to do the studies, and then once the studies are done, that's how we move forward. And there's a bit of a breakdown there very often, and we can come back to that at some point. But tired of waiting, and a lot of folks are just saying, whoever's in charge, get it done. Whatever that means, get it done.
I'm guilty of saying that.
Right? And so that's definitely something that we've heard. There's a desire for something that's modern and impactful. Definitely, like, sleek and sexy is something that people want, but you know what? Putting in a timed light that connects to a bus that has Wi-Fi in it, that's not fancy. You can't see that when you're driving down the road, but it could be hugely impactful. Wanting to see things versus wanting things to improve is definitely where we need to move people, I think, sometimes. But and then also improvements to the existing roadways, the way we manage traffic right now. HOV enforcement is always something that comes up. And then ramp improvements, interchange improvements. I mean, the downtown loop has not been improved since it was put in, and it was not put in for the amount of traffic that it experiences right now. And so that's also part of what we're working on in the future, that those ramps are short and you change lanes, and that creates the congestion in and of itself. Promote the existing service. This is something that's really important. And I don't know, and outside of other communities, how aware you would be of what's going on with WeGo, but I'd hope you're aware of what's going on with the Franklin Transit Authority around here. Making sure that we're promoting how people can get to services that already exist is really important, and enhancing the existing service. This becomes a challenge when you ask the taxpayers to fund improvements to the service, and then they say no, and then you go to a public meeting and they say improve the transit service. So we kind of get stuck in a competition of opinions there. Cost of increasing housing, having to drive further from your job, or your job moving out where the office space is less expensive, and that's all becoming a challenge. Bike paths, sidewalks, they're all part of the process and the improvements we need to make. And then CSX always comes up. And so we've had a handful of meetings with CSX, and we can talk a lot about that more. But for every day of the week, there are opinions from every perspective. And so that's going to be the biggest challenge here is to find, we need to find consent to move forward. Getting a consensus will probably never be the true that's just so limited in its opportunity. But we need consent to have enough information and enough guidance and enough analysis to say, okay, we can move forward.
Speaking of CSX, just since you mentioned it, I hear that a lot too. And what my understanding, and I want y'all to correct me, I'm just going to say what I think and then let you respond to that. But there's a lot of commuter trains on tracks up in the Northeast, Midwest, which is where all the factories that are now down here used to be. So there's not as much demand for train tracks for freight in many areas up north, but yet there are increasing demands on the tracks here. So CSX is not real interested in having another train on their track carrying commuters. Is that right, Tim?
CSX has expressed that, they're not interested in mixing passenger trains and freight trains on their track. And there are safety issues that come with even thinking about that type of mix, as well as capacity. It's a growing freight line. The economy of this corridor and all of Middle Tennessee, is dependent upon, the freight rail lines. But we have been talking and continue to talk with CSX, on this particular project and what might the opportunities be in terms of the right-of-way in general. Well, maybe not on the track itself, but what about next to the track or within a certain proximity of the track? I think, it's there's a little bit of commuter rail already with the Music City Star in Nashville, so it's a known quantity here. And folks are wondering, wow, we have this great line, and when you look at it from just a map point of view, it's ideal. I mean, from downtown Nashville, it hits the communities, the heart of them, the employment centers, but obviously it's a freight line. So that's still an open question. It is very challenging, as you're talking about, but, not on the tracks themselves, but what we're looking at right now is what would it take to go run alongside within the right-of-way.
And I'd like to add real quickly about your comment about the freight capacity. This is a very busy, Radnor Yard is a very busy facility for them. And while we often see freight trains parked, they're parked because it's a lot of times overcrowded. They're trying to get trucks in and out of their yard so that they can continue to move goods. And we order a lot of stuff from Amazon. And we order a lot of things that have to be put on freight trains to go to other places. And so we need to be mindful in the conversation of CSX is that the more is on trains, the fewer trucks potentially could be on our roadways. And so there's we have to be mindful of that.
Tim, you and I talked about this a little bit the other day. But there are some pinch points, as you call them. I don't know if everybody's looked down as you go across Old Hickory Boulevard in Brentwood, but the train track is 100 feet below ground level, maybe more than that. I don't know. It's way down there. And it's in a really narrow, just a gulch that couldn't be more than 30, 40, 50 feet wide. I don't know, just wide enough for a train to go through it. So putting another track alongside that is not an option. And I raised that question, and you had a really good answer to it.
Well, it's money, but at this point we're looking at what's the potential out there. Can it be done or can it not be done? What are the pinch points as you were describing? And in some cases, when we look at other cities that have that type of service, let's say Austin, Texas, is that they had a couple of pinch points and they went over. Rather than saying, well, we know we can't go alongside, there isn't room, but we can take the passenger trains over the freight tracks and then land where land opens up again. So there are some possibilities out there, but we're still in the process of looking at, well, how can you run something through? And over the course of the next few months, we'll find out what the impacts will be, and that's what gets taken out to everyone to take a look at, and how do we evaluate that compared to some of the other options that we're looking at.
This will be the first study and the first time that I'm aware of that we will have an actual, these are the parameters CSX gave us if we are going to try to operate within their space in some capacity, and this is what it will cost. And so that will hopefully really give us the opportunity to say, oh, that is not worth it, or let's progress and see what this is like.
Okay, to use Tom Lawrence's phraseology, this is your curveball. But the Music City Star has ridership a couple thousand a day. That's about right. So 2,000 folks a day choose to ride the commuter train from Wilson County or east of town into downtown Nashville. And the traffic on I-65 in Cool Springs is about 160,000 a day, I think, 150. Sean, is that close? So how do you get, a meaningful portion of those 150,000 cars off of I-65 onto a commuter train if you're only getting a couple of thousand to do it from Wilson County?
Well, can I talk about Wilson?
Is that a fair question?
It is, but let me give you a little context about Wilson County.
Sure.
So, in the Music City Star. So the Music City Star shares the railway with freight. And so it can only operate certain times of the day, so it's very limited. And so it is, people that ride it in, they have to be in by 9 or something, and they have, the last train leaves at 6. So it isn't an all-day, super frequent. That makes it a challenge.
That's not a CSX track, right?
It is not. It's a Nashville Northeastern.
Yeah. Local track. So they're a little more flexible than CSX.
Because I'm going to ask Sean to continue talking about this, but the shortest answer to your question is convenience. And so if it is more convenient or equally as convenient, people will take off and make changes in their behavior periodically.
Right.
Yeah, I think it gets to the competitiveness of what are your options into your employment or downtown. If transit can be competitive with driving your car but by yourself, then people will start to utilize it. I think one thing that we've been looking at is some of the congestion data along I-65, and it's been getting worse since between 2016 and 2019, and some of the speeds I think that we were looking at on a afternoon commuting southbound were in the 20 mile per hour range, and some of you have probably even experienced slower. But I think as congestion worsens too, and people are spending more and more time, they are more interested in what those alternatives look like. I know I've been stuck on 65 headed southbound, wishing that I could find another way to get home.
Right. Our time's going away quickly, but what you call the baseline investments are I guess what you would call low-hanging fruit. Is that correct? That you are hearing or seeing, Tim?
Yeah, that's a kind of a good way of describing them. One of the things you see on the screen is bus on shoulder. When I was with the transit agency in Cincinnati, as director of planning, we developed the bus on shoulder program. And that's not something that runs during rush hour at 65, 70 miles an hour or whatever, but that's the opportunity to use the shoulder when traffic is so slow, let's say 30 miles or 35 miles an hour or slower, then the bus has the option of getting to the shoulder and go maybe 10 or 15 miles faster than traffic. And that doesn't seem extremely fast, but when you're crawling, and even if that bus is going at 25 miles an hour and you're going at 5, that seems like it's going at 65. There is no better commercial for, hey, maybe I'm going to give public transportation a try, than to see a bunch of happy people on that bus cruising by, getting to their destination.
Reading their morning paper.
That's right, or looking at their device nowadays.
Yeah.
But it's also, in addition to speed and frequency, it's a lot about reliability. Is that people want to really get into that habit to say, if I leave my home at this time regularly, unless there's some disaster going on, that I can get to my destination at that same travel speed, time every day. Mm-hmm. It may take them a little bit longer, but when it's reliable, people get into that habit and they start to like it, and become transit users in many cases. And the bus on shoulder program, as part of that low-hanging fruit, is a possibility out there.
Right. The buses are not, bus ridership has not been a real increasing thing across the U.S. over the last few years, as I understand it. How do you get people on buses instead of, what you're saying, just showing them that they can get there quicker is obviously the best thing. What else, Michelle?
Everywhere we have these conversations, people say, how do I get someone out of their car? Because we're a car culture. And my rebuttal to that is always, we're a convenience culture. And when it's convenient, we'll try to do something different. And so, to Tim's point, when I can walk out of my office or down the street and I don't have to look at my watch, I just know a bus or a train is coming in 15 minutes, that's when people will use it. So when it's consistent and reliable, that's the key.
The chamber takes trips every year or so to various cities to get ideas about how they're handling growth and that sort of thing. And we've been to Austin, we've been to Denver. They went to Washington, D.C. last year. I was not able to go on that trip. The one thing that I've saw in Denver, though, that intrigued me, and Tim and I talked about it a little bit, I always thought toll roads had to be off through a whole new corridor somewhere where you got to find a gap between the housing and make a new road. But out there, they actually have what they call hot lanes, high occupancy toll lanes. And they have just added 2 more lanes to the US 36 corridor between Denver and Boulder. And if you want to ride on those toll lanes in the middle, you either pay the toll or you get a ticket. Kind of like our high occupancy vehicle lanes, but they're enforced a little more solidly out there, it looks like. What are the challenges to maybe doing that here, Tim? You've got 160,000 cars a day now on 4 lanes. If you could add 2 more lanes, would that increase your capacity by 50%?
That I don't have the answer to in terms of what the capacity possibilities might be, because that depends on utilization of it. It's challenging to add tolls to an existing federal interstate highway. The Denver Boulder example is US 36. US really means a state road. But there are some opportunities where if you're adding lanes, let's say in the middle, you'd have to work with the federal government and obviously TDOT on doing this, but there are some opportunities there. Tolling nowadays, there's no toll booths. There are cameras and a lot of electronics, and if you don't have the monitor on your dashboard, then you get something in the mail. Anyone's been to any other city on vacation, Miami or whatever, you'll get a little bill. But in any event, they're there for public transit and carpoolers, ride free. And then in terms of if you're a single occupant driver, you can use that, but you have to pay the price. And in many areas, it's not just a flat rate. It's, they've got to figure it out based upon congestion, where it's a variable price thing. But it does help pay for the facility and pay for additional congestion, for additional capacity. But it is also, a nice multimodal, a good option in terms of multimodal usage of a facility. So cars, buses, and people who are ride sharing.
Do those toll lanes pay for the improvement?
Well, I think the jury's still out at this point because it's a fairly new phenomenon. But obviously, a lot of public agencies, such as in Denver and Boulder, Colorado, have worked it out where they feel that the revenue stream that comes in, is enough to pay off the bonds to build the facility, and apparently then to also do ongoing maintenance of the facility as well.
Right.
And on that question, roadways don't pay for themselves. And so that is something that is, we hear this a lot in meetings where people will say, well, why can't the people that ride the bus why can't the bus fare just pay for the bus? Mm-hmm. It's just not how it works. It's not even how it works when we're on the roadways today. Our user fees and gas taxes do not fully pay for the maintenance and improvements to our roadways.
Right. So the low-hanging fruit would be just improving the bus systems and those sorts of things. The mass transit options. We got 10 minutes left. Goodness gracious. But mass transit is much more expensive, and we've talked about commuter rail quite a bit. But what are the realistic, and where I wanted to go with this? What are the realistic possibilities of not just including Nashville, but including the region in a revenue district, however you want to call it, and actually addressing some of these things regionally? And Michelle, give us a...
It's incredibly possible. I mean, that's why we're here. That's why we're doing this, is that so that we have another program of projects to tie into the existing plans that are out there to go to more voters over time and say, let's do this as a regional in perspective. And so it's incredibly, the answer is yes, it's possible. Mm-hmm. What's it going to look like once we get to that point? I can't tell you at this moment because we're still in this process and there's still other processes underway, but that's the only way to get it done is regionally.
Right. I do want to take a couple minutes and see if any of our audience has questions because I know I haven't thought of all the questions yet. I haven't even said all the ones I have. But,
Gary Buchanan, before y'all were born, you three, not Dave and I, and a few others in this room, but HOV lanes were put in on the corridor. It was a big fanfare. Highway patrol, motorcycles, cars, enforcement, people carpooled. And a couple of days a week, I do use the corridor going and coming from Nashville. It's evident to me there is no enforcement. And I'm not being critical of TDOT, but the response you get from TDOT is we get funding for having so many HOV lanes from the federal government.
Yep. Correct.
Now, my question to you three is, with the initiative you are trying to get going, what are your hopes or what are your initiatives around enforcement of HOV lanes, which would approve carpooling. Thank you.
So over the last couple of years, there has been legislation that has come up at the state level to enforce the HOV lanes. Right now, we're in a situation where the troopers say, that's not our jurisdiction because it's in a city. The city says we don't have enough manpower to be doing that, but also if we're pulling people over on the left-hand lane, we're going to create more congestion. So it's a lot of finger pointing right now. One of the best options would be to install cameras to take photos of people and then ticket them that way. That is something that is going to have to be approved by our state legislature. So our initiative to move forward on that is to help people understand we need to tell our state electeds we need help, and we need you to let us have these options to enforce.
Scott Speedy, Franklin Alderman here. We got a couple of aldermen here, and get ready. But you get out in the community a lot. What do you hear about? What do you think our citizenship as a whole really wants to see?
I would say they would want to see improvements to the Franklin Transit Authority. I think the Cool Springs corridor, that loop, is very important. I also do hear that while Franklin Transit is very expensive, they look at the state and the local subsidies, and you break it down per ride, and it's like, and you talked about that you can't look at it price per ride, but right now we're looking at $34.
No, it's
and so should we just hand out a bunch of $10 Uber tickets and triple our ridership? Okay, good. We get that. And you're back to your convenience culture. I'm critical of all the elementary schools around. You look at the number of parents that just drive their kids to school, and we do here at 3 o'clock. Why is there all this traffic on South Royal Oaks? They're driving to Moore Elementary and Liberty Elementary. Put your kids on the bus. And I think if we don't mandatory busing, they're never going to ride the bus when they're adults. So,
no.
Good point. Ann Peterson. Stand up, Ann. You've been on the Planning Commission or Board of Mayor and Aldermen for a few years. I won't make you say how long. But we shared the podium there back in the late 80s, I remember. So what do you hear, and what do you think as a result of what you're hearing around town?
Well, there are many things. This is not, anything that's going to be simple or cheap, either one. But I'm going to say something on my personal life. When we drove over here today, we crossed 65, and all my working time, I was going to Columbia. In other words, I was going in the opposite direction, and I was saying, thank heaven that I had been going in that direction. Now, it's even more unbelievable. But speaking of that, another thing is that in Williamson County, we have as many people coming into the county as we have going out. And so that is not typical, and I'd be interested to hear about how that makes a difference in how things would work here.
Sean? Go ahead.
I think I would just add on the movement north and south on the corridor, I think is ideal for, a solution that we come up with, because a lot of the time you have just the inbound trips and then deadhead of the train going back, or bus or whatever it is, and so there's not as much utilization back and forth. But I think given the movement of folks up and down the corridor, that you'd see even more utilization both north and south.
I think Sean hit the nail on the head that transit wants a couple of things. It wants a pedestrian environment. You have to walk to the train or the bus at some point in your commute, but also having anchor destinations along the way to help justify that. Yes, you have that big movement going into town in the morning, but you still have a lot of people. Then when it heads back, that will be riding to destinations down in the corridor itself. So, it creates a lot of congestion today, but it is an opportunity to look at some transit options to help, provide choice and capacity in the future.
Time for one more. All right. Tell us who you are.
Bob Wilkins. You mentioned people wanting a solution, wanting something implemented. And one of your slides talked about 4 studies over the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. What did we gain? What did it help us over those studies that were implemented?
So the studies have led to the development of the In Motion plan, which is the necessary strategic plan to have to start building out long-term investments in transit. And the plans also, the studies, also had conversations like this on the ground where we were able to talk to people to find out what they wanted and what they need. And also it informed us from a data perspective to better understand the landscape of the region. Now, as staff, I will tell you what is incredibly frustrating is to know that we are working really hard and we are spending $1 million of our taxpayer money too, and we don't want this to sit on a shelf. And so while I can point to this study turned into this plan, which turned into that investment, it would be delightful if it was more, if it moved faster and it had a greater impact quicker.
That's probably part of the frustration.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And some of this stuff is slow. I mean, we're dealing with, we've got to go through environmental regulations and we've got to go through planning. I mean, there's a lot of purposeful. I don't want to sound like it, just because it's frustrating doesn't mean it doesn't have a good purpose, but it just takes a while.
I would just piggyback off of Michelle's comment too. We've been doing a regional attitudinal survey, 2010, 2014, and we're scheduled to do one in the coming month or so. And what those have identified is not only, people have indicated that they're experiencing heavy congestion more frequently on their daily commutes, but also when it gets to our funding question, people are not unanimously, supporting all of the taxing or fees, increasing them. But over time, what we have seen is that people are more willing to pay either an additional fee or a tax related to transportation improvements. And so, I think those are kind of coupled where things are getting worse, on the ground, and people's perceptions and behavior is gradually changing as well.
And on this, really quickly, something interesting on the attitudinal surveys from 2015, whatever year it was that the majority of people, when asked, would you pay a tax or fee to make improvements to transit? The answer was yes. When they mostly asked, like 60%. When it was asked, do you think your neighbor would pay? The answer was like 60% no. So what was fascinating about that is it's like, I'll pay, but I don't think Sean's gonna pay. And so that was a really interesting thing to learn, because if we all realized that we thought this way, maybe when we, from the elected level, looked at it a little differently.
Tom Creek, can we take a couple extra minutes? There's one thing I really wanted to get from you, Tim, because you've been all over the country. You've seen probably every transportation system in the country, of every major metro area. Which one works the best, where the ridership is increasing instead of decreasing? Which one do you like the best, and how could it be overlaid to Middle Tennessee?
That's a hard one to answer, because there's so many different, local situations that vary from what we see here in Middle Tennessee. One of the examples we use is Denver. For that example, in terms of the US 36 bus rapid transit combined with the managed lanes project. Denver has a very robust and expanding light rail system. They've got their, growth limitations. I mean, they've got a mountain range, on one side, so they can only go so far. And, a lot of growth, a lot of traffic. I mean, some parallels to Nashville. One of the pictures that we had on this presentation that shows light rail is Charlotte. Similar size to Nashville, similar inner highway loop. Music industry there, finance industry there. Yours is a lot more fun, but they make a lot of money there, but a lot of congestion. And they're going with the combination of bus rapid transit and light rail. And they've made that commitment that this is what it's going to take to provide more capacity to help with congestion, as well as to help build this region and make it more economically competitive. And for a lot of areas, that's what it's all about. So those are some examples.
Great. We could talk for another hour. I'd love to pick your brain some more, but time is what it is. Tell us, Michelle, how everyone that's listening in this morning or watching can participate in the survey and be a part of this.
Absolutely. So if you would go to southcorridor.org, that's our website for the study. You can participate in, the folks in the room here have a survey on their chair that we'd love to have you fill out if you're so willing to leave with us when you go. You can participate in the survey online. Your question about what works in other communities, we have interactive tools where you can look at different modes and how they are operating in different parts of the country and kind of toggle between. We have a little survey that you can take you answer all these questions and it says, you prefer this type of service. So that kind of like helps you learn maybe what your thoughts are about something. And our social media, South Corridor, on all the South Corridor study on all the socials. So to keep up with us, because we're continuing to trying to be out in the community, have meetings, host meetings, and if you want us to come talk to your group, reach out and we will be there. So awesome.
Better wind it up. So glad that you all could make it. We appreciate our sponsors that in a financial way help make this happen, Vanderbilt and AT&T. We appreciate Community Coffee for making sure we've got caffeine here every month, and they do a great job at that. Kel, am I missing anyone? Kel McDowell and Nancy Conway and the team at Williamson Inc. Coordinate all this and make sure that Creed over at WCTV and Tom at WAKM get it all together here for us. And of course, we appreciate Dr. Darrell and Columbia State for giving us this amazing facility. Again, if you haven't been here, you need to come see it. And look forward to having you back next month. Our guest next month will be the mayor and city manager or city administrator from the city of Brentwood. We're going to pick their brains and find out what the new mayor plans to do in Brentwood, and hope you'll be back for that. Thank you very much, and see you next month.